Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're here with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. Senator, I want to start on Puerto Rico. There's been a lot of criticism of the federal response, but the administration and Marco Rubio have said Puerto Rico is a special case. It's not like Texas and Florida. There were existing challenges in Puerto Rico, a weak electrical grid, those kinds of things that are really a part of evaluating what's happening there.
Well, first of all, the president, instead of tweeting against the mayor of San Juan, who's watching her people die and just made a plea for help, or to roll up his sleeves and get to work here. The bottom line is, at least for the first week and a half, the effort has been slow-footed, disorganized, and not adequate. And that's not just me saying it. General Buchanan said he doesn't have enough troops or material. The acting secretary of HHS, Duke, when she visited, said that things are not good. And so the bottom line is that we need more help. Marco Rubio is right, we need control and command. That means many more military troops. Let me give you an example. In Haiti, there were 22,000 troops after 2 weeks here. Right now, there are 10,000. There haven't been 10,000, and those are very, very recent. So this has not been a good response. It needs the president to stop calling names, stop downgrading the motives of people who are calling for help, but roll up his sleeves and get to work. And by the way, he should have gone to Puerto Rico earlier than 2 weeks. He'll go Tuesday. That's good. But 2 weeks after it hit. He was in Texas twice after that. Obama was up at Sandy 2 days afterwards. They say, oh, there are logistics that get in the way. But the president going makes a huge difference, and logistics didn't get in the way in the past. Well,
I guess they would argue that Puerto Rico is just a much different case than Florida or Texas. But let's move on here to tax reform quickly. You've been talking to the president about making deals with the president. Is this something you can do a deal with the president on?
Well, look, we Democrats sent a letter to the Republican leadership and the president, said that here were 3 things that we thought tax reform ought to have. One, tax breaks ought not to go to the top 1%, but ought to be focused on the middle class. 2, it ought not blow a hole in the deficit. And 3, it ought to be done in a bipartisan way, not through reconciliation. Unfortunately, the Republican plan doesn't agree with any of those. First, it's completely focused on the wealthy and the powerful, not on the middle class. Second, it blows a huge hole in the deficit. And third, they said they're going to do it through reconciliation. That's a partisan process. It excludes Democrats. It's the same process that led to the demise on health care. And let me just address one thing, John. Speaker Ryan keeps saying it helps the middle class. That's not true. What he's saying and what the plan is are totally different. Let me go over 3 quick points. 1, they get rid of the estate tax. The only people who benefit are the very wealthy, estates over $11 million. 5,000 estates will get over $3 million each. Second, they lower the top rate from 39 to 35. That affects the wealthy. They raise the lowest rate from 10 to 12. That affects working people.
But that also knocks a lot of people off the rolls, Senator. People no longer have to pay taxes, which means that's good for them.
No, they already don't have to pay taxes, but to lower the top rate and raise the bottom rate does not make any sense at all. And third, here's what the Tax Policy Center, 80% of the tax breaks in their plan are aimed at the top 1%. And the top 0.1%, the people who make over $5 million, who are 1 in 1,000, get a tax break of over $1 million. The middle class, at the same time, is hurt. Just one more point here. The Achilles heel of this, the first one, there are many, is state and local deductibility. In suburban, fairly well-off districts, Republican, throughout the states like New York, California, Illinois, New Jersey, those people, even with the standard deduction, will pay a lot more.
But why
It'll be a real test of their Congresspeople. It should be a real test of their Congresspeople, whether they vote with their constituents or they vote with the hard right ideology against state and local deductibility.
Well, the argument on state and local is why should Alabama subsidize New York? But it sounds like you're basically out now to stop this bill, not to shape it.
Well, we'd like them to change. We would like them to really say it'll be deficit neutral instead of using these fake numbers that say, oh, there'll be huge growth. You know, they tried that in Kansas. That's Charles Koch's state. And this was the great experiment. They dramatically cut taxes and said there's going to be growth and an increase in the surplus. Well, after they did it, they predicted that the surplus would go up 300 million. It went down. The deficit went down 700 million. They had to cut money for schools and infrastructure, and then they had to put in a tax increase. And did Kansas grow? No. Last year, its growth was 0.2% versus U.S. growth at 1.6%. So this idea that cutting taxes on the wealthy, this trickle-down economics, which the Republican Party loves, does not create growth. It never has. Does not reduce the deficit. It never has. George Bush, his tax cuts, 2001, 2003, they said after 10 years, the deficit will go down. It went up by CBO's point, 1.6 trillion. So this is fake numbers helping the very, very wealthy, ignoring the middle class. And what Ryan said and what his proposal are totally different.
All right, well, we're out of time, Senator. Thanks.
Sorry.
We'll be
I feel strongly about this. But we want to work with them if they will change. We do. They have to consult us. They have to consult us. They can't just put down a plan and say bipartisanship is you guys come over and do what we want when it's against our principles.
All right. Well, you've been talking to the president. I bet you'll give him that message. Thanks, Senator. We'll be back with our panel. Don't go away. All right. And now we're going to try and analyze all of this. Amy Walter is the national editor at the Cook Political Report. Ben Domenech is the founder and publisher of The Federalist, and Ezra Klein is the editor-in-chief at Vox.com. Ben, I want to start with you in Puerto Rico. We just assess the blame here. Obviously, there's blame to go around. Where does it lie?
Well, I think that there's a significant blame to be placed in a lot of different places. But just first off, my family is Puerto Rican. We have many friends and relatives who are there right now. They're going through an incredibly challenging time. Puerto Rico is different in a lot of key ways from Florida and Texas. You can't just get the debris out of a place in the same way when it is an island. And I think that one of the biggest problems that Puerto Rico has is that their infrastructure was not in a good position even before this storm arrived. Part of the problem in Puerto Rico is that the politics of the island has been entirely driven by the question of status, what your position is on statehood versus Commonwealth versus independence. And that's led to a lot of different people getting elected politically who can take a position on that and argue for it in a fluent way, but aren't necessarily the kind of infrastructure-minded, diligent workers that you want to be in place when a crisis like this comes to bear. Clearly, the aid got to the island in a lot of different places, but did not get to the people who needed it. It hasn't been delivered that last mile. And that is going to require, I think, a lot more effort than what you might see for a domestic storm in a similar situation, in part because the people who are there in leadership on that island have not had the experience of having to deliver with such a heavy lift in the past.
So, Ezra, that's the local view. On the federal issue, Marco Rubio said basically that the problem with the response was they were planning for a certain kind of disaster, and it turned out to be more tricky in Puerto Rico. So isn't that the job in a disaster, to adapt at the federal level and know that Puerto Rico is different than Florida and Texas, and therefore be able to basically adapt? That was kind of the promise of having a businessman in the Oval Office. What's your sense of that?
Adapt and predict and focus, right? I mean, there are things they've said about Puerto Rico about how it's different, and it is different. But when Donald Trump comes out and says the thing about Puerto Rico is it's an island in the middle of the ocean, that was pre-existing knowledge. We knew that before Hurricane Maria hit. There was a real lack of focus in the White House. I mean, every bit of reporting we have seen so far, and also what we saw publicly from Donald Trump during the critical first days after the hurricane, has shown this. This is a hurricane that was predicted. It hit Puerto Rico in much the way we thought it was going to hit Puerto Rico. They didn't have a high-level White House meeting on this, including Trump, but with the right people in the room, for 6 days. And during that period, it's not like Donald Trump was out there talking incessantly about Puerto Rico or at the White House focusing on Puerto Rico. He was playing golf. He was picking fights with the NFL. Focus in any White House, given the number of things they need to do, is one of the truly scarce key qualities. You need to have people running herd on these kinds of projects if you're going to be able to adapt, if you're going to be able to bring to bear the amount of resources you need to. And this was, at the very least, a failure of management and a failure of focus.
Amy, the focus, at least in part from the president recently, has been on the mayor of San Juan. How is that a help?
It does. It is the short answer. And I think that has been the challenge for the president all along, which is when there's criticism that comes at him, his response is to lash back. And even those who are supporters of the president say, I wish you would just stop tweeting and start, to Ezra's point, keep focused. But fundamentally, I think, unfortunately, what this does is it brings us back to this place where if you are on a certain side of the aisle, you're going to side, you put on your jersey and you side with the mayor. If you're on the other side of the aisle, you put on your jersey and you side with the president. And once again, we're back to taking something that is a really serious humanitarian crisis, and it's become now a test of your political fealty. Are you in this tribe or this tribe? And this, I think, is both where we are at this place in time, and it's also what so many voters hate about where we are at this place in time. And that the unifying theme that should be, we're in a crisis, let's all get together, has now become a test of who are you, more in alliance with.
Ben, let's switch to taxes here. Chuck Schumer has just given the opposition view, and I don't think he took a breath. What's your sense of both? Let's start first with policy of this. What do you make of the unified Republican framework?
Well, I think that Republicans are obviously far more comfortable talking about taxes than they are talking about health care.
And the president, for sure.
They're happy to run into the teeth of any kind of oppositional argument on the tax policy issue because they're so used to making these arguments and they come so naturally to them. I think, though, that one of the things that Chuck Schumer brought up that is going to be a critical question here is this issue of state and local tax deductibility. There are a number of different Republicans who come from blue or purple states that are in these suburbanite sort of areas that have benefited from this state and local tax deduction in the past. That's a lot of different House members who are in states like California who are going to have a tough time going to their constituents and basically saying, yes, I'm going to remove this out of an act of fairness, as you said, to the taxpayers of Alabama, but they aren't elected by the taxpayers of Alabama. And I think that this could turn out to be one of the stickier subjects that they have to deal with in terms of the debate within their conference on this issue.
The state and local tax issue. Ezra, where do you take a hold of this plan?
So right now, I think it's important to say the plan lacks a lot of details. For instance, we don't know if there will be 3 or 4 tax brackets. But given what we have, the Tax Policy Center, which does the best tax modeling work in Washington, looked at it. And I think there are 3 numbers that are worth thinking about here. So far, Republicans have said this is going to be deficit neutral, and it's going to retain the current code's progressivity. So Tax Policy Center looked at the plan, made what assumptions they could make, and said, if you sort of do the best model you can, this plan is going to give the top 1% a tax cut of $130,000 on average each. People in the middle class a tax cut of about $660. It's very hard to look at those numbers and say that's a progressive plan. And then it's going to cost about $2.5 trillion. So somehow, if you're going to have it deficit neutral, you got to pay for all that $2.5 trillion. And if you're going to have it be as progressive as the current code is, you're going to have to somehow change deductions and put in a bracket and do a lot of things that are going to really shift that. I am very skeptical they're going to make those changes.
And also, you're fixing the deficit impacts of the plan, which means you don't have any money from growth to pay for the underlying deficit and debt issues, which they have talked about in the past. Yeah. Amy, giving the numbers that Ezra just talked about, the president campaigned for the forgotten man, yeah, the little guy. How do you think that plays out when the numbers are disparate and when obviously the Democrats are making this case about that it's basically just going to the top?
I think there are a couple of challenges Republicans have. The first is, as we've seen with health care, being the opposition party, it was very easy to craft a message on health care. When you're the party in charge and actually have to pass something where there's give and takes, where you're going to have to put this coalition together, it's much more difficult. I think tax reform is going to fit in that same boat. It is something that is much more unifying for Republicans, but they still run up against, and I think Ben's exactly right on the issue of the state and local tax issue, as well as other issues that are going to come up as they're putting this framework together. The second is that this tax debate, much like healthcare, is being driven by the clock and the calendar more so than by deeper policy arguments. You talk to Republicans who are very upset they didn't get healthcare through. They say we have to get tax reform done. It's almost a non-issue about what it looks like as much as we got to get this done, because if we go into 2018 without a tax cut, without anything to tell our constituents, we're going to get killed in the midterm elections. I don't think that's a great way to make policy, is being worried about running out of time for budget reconciliation, running out of time before a midterm election.
Ben, in 1986, tax reform took 2 years.
Yes, they are definitely rushing, I think, to get this done with a mind on what's going to happen in 2018. One of the things that's not going to happen in 2018, obviously, is that Bob Corker is not going to be running for re-election. I think Republican senator from Tennessee.
I
think that story is actually one of the most significant stories to happen this past week, which had a lot of different significant stories because it's step one, I think, of a wave of retirements, people deciding not to run for re-election within the 18 and 20 cycle. There's a number of Republican senators who've had enormous influence over that conference for a long time, but they're now all in their 80s and they're approaching that point where they have to decide whether they want to stick around in Washington or not. I think the fractiousness of debates like these on healthcare and on taxes increases the likelihood that they exit.
Yeah, and if they don't pass a tax cut, this is what a lot of Republicans are worried about on the House side, that you are going to see a wave of retirements come January, February. Folks said, we were here for a year, we had total control, we didn't get stuff done. I don't know if I want to be here for longer. That is a very, very big concern.
And then you had an Alabama primary this week, Ezra, where some of these issues were already playing out. The Republican primary.
And a primary where it looks like it's only going to become more fractious. If Roy Moore does win that, that's a real problem for Mitch McConnell. I do just want to say one thing about the tax effort, which is there was a deal here. I was talking to a top Democratic staffer for the kind of Democrat they need to get in the Senate and could get. And he said, look, we could have done corporate repatriation for infrastructure, middle-class tax cuts, and corporate tax reform. And Democrats would have helped on that. They would have been involved in that. Think about the Trump administration, this Republican Party. They don't try. They could try to get bipartisan support and then go for the partisan bill if that fails, but they don't try at the front end. And so this is going to be a much more fractious plan. And by the end of it, if it doesn't go well, Democrats are not going to need to come on board. And that's a political mistake they're making.
But consider why Roy Moore is even the nominee. Moore is the nominee because Mitch McConnell decided that Mo Brooks, a conservative congressman in the Ted Cruz mode who was also a critic of McConnell, was someone who needed to be destroyed in the primary. He parachuted in millions of dollars getting rid of this conservative candidate, thinking that Moore would be an easy candidate for Luther Strange to beat. As it turned out, Strange was too conflicted given his relationship to the governor of Alabama and the appointment that happened. That ended up dragging him down, and that's why you end up with someone like Moore instead of potentially a more traditional but problematic conservative from McConnell's perspective.
All right, we're going to have to end it there because Bob Schieffer is here, and he'll take the chair away from you. He's coming up right next, so stay with us. And we're back with the one and only Bob Schieffer. He is a CBS News political contributor and the author of a new book, Overload: Finding the Truth in Today's Deluge of News. Welcome back, Bob.
Thank you.
So you set out with this book to figure out whether we are better informed or just overloaded. You talked to reporters and news editors, and so where did you come out at the end of this?
We're overwhelmed. We've never been through anything quite like this, probably since the invention of the printing press. You know, we talk about the invention of the printing press, how it improved literacy, it caused the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. But there was also 30 years of religious wars that followed the printing press, and it took about 3 decades for the world to finally reach equilibrium. We're at the very beginning of what's going on right now in this digital age that has taken the place of print. It's affected nothing more than the way we get the news and our politics. Let me just give you one little stat here, John. In 2004, 1 reporter in 8 lived in New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. That number is now down to 1 in 5 live in those 3 places. In a lot of parts of the country right now, it's not a question of biased news or too much news, it's a question of no news. 62% of people are now getting their news from social media, from Facebook. And while those are great vehicles, they don't exactly follow the same standards that we did in the mainstream media and still do, and that is we don't print or broadcast something unless we check it out and find out if it's true. So there's all this news out there right now. You don't know who to believe. Is it true? Is it not true? And that's what we're sorting our way through right now.
And so the new medium is shakier in terms of standards and also fewer reporters out in the real part of the country. In other words, everybody's in their bubble now.
Yes, and we're no longer basing our opinions on the same data. If you listen to one channel, you get one set of facts. If you listen to another channel or read another publication, you get another set of facts. So what's different now is we're basing our opinion on different data. It's not the common data that in the old, more orderly days of what I call the gatekeeper era, where you had 3 television stations and 1 newspaper in every town. Maybe you didn't agree with the editorial policy, but you took pretty much for granted that what was on the front page, or what Walter Cronkite said, was true, that he had gone to the trouble of checking it out. Now there are 700 channels out there. We're bombarded with so much information, we simply cannot process it.
And so it's the facts are more in question. And also you have a great quote at the start of the book about attention span. I mean, that's another huge challenge of our current moment.
Well, it certainly is. I mean, when we've gone to 30-second commercials on television, that has reduced our attention span. It's also reduced our patience. It's also made us less patient with things. It's made us, I think, ruder and a different kind of society. You know, you and I have talked about this, about the dialogue in the 2016 campaign and how crude and rude it was. I think a lot of that has to do with social media, because the dialogue in politics this year was much like the thread on a blog post. Somebody posts a blog and then somebody else says, no, that's stupid. And then somebody else says, no, you're stupid. And then it's blankety blank stupid. We go from the inane to the profane, but I'm not sure that we have improved our knowledge.
What can we do in the press? If you're giving advice to a young journalist, what's your advice right now about how to navigate all this?
Well, I think you have to remember what the role of journalists is, and that is basically, we are not the politician. The politician's job is to deliver a message. Our job is simply to check it out and find out if it's true or if it's false, and then report the results of that. We're not here to run the government. We're not here to run politics. We're here to report on the people who are involved in politics and government. And if we do that right, we have performed a service that is crucial to democracy as the right to vote. We can't have a democracy like we have unless citizens have access to independently gathered information that they can compare with the government's version of events. And when they do that, we've done our job.
So we have about 30 seconds left. What then is the consumer's job here in looking at this whole swarm? Is there something they can do better?
Buyer beware. Trust the sources. Depend not on one source, but as many sources as you can to come to your own conclusions about what's going on here.
All right. Our trusted source, Bob Schieffer. Thanks very much, Bob.
Thank you, John.
Congratulations on the book. And we'll be right back. You can keep up with the news of the week by subscribing to the Face the Nation Diary podcast. Find us on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.